as a weakness, and not an intended sort of act of violence or sort of something that's orchestrated, but sort of a bad habit that he's having trouble kicking. And so, of course, I must be understanding and must be forgiving. And that leaves her trapped in that situation. So they don't identify it as a risk factor, as a problem, but rather see it as something that they have the responsibility to understand and help the husbands through. There's also a culture surrounding drinking, in the sense that many of particularly the migrant or immigrant men who work very long hours would come home after their shift, and all they want to do is have a drink and relax. And the last thing you need is your wife nagging you and saying, stop drinking, you're over drinking, and you're going to get, you're going to become brash and violent. And so that's a big sort of, it's none of the wife's business if I want to sit down and have a drink with my friends, and so I'll get a little loud, and that's okay because I've earned it, it's my day. So that's the tendency, and so things sort of escalate, and you've got this in the mix, but none of the service providers interviewed felt able to deal with both. It was always either or. And in Hong Kong, especially for the cultural minorities, there was no sensitized program to be able to deliver either rehabilitation or other sort of preventive or intervening strategies in a culturally sensitive manner, or even in a language that was accessible to them. So if you don't speak English or Chinese, there was no substance abuse related program that could assist you. In terms of literature review and interventions of what other people were doing, I found in Australia and the UK, there were more coherent strategies and holistic approaches developed in terms of best practice models, which would be worth looking at and seeing how they integrate help seeking and interventions for both domestic violence and substance abuse in that context to assist the family context as a whole, rather than just focusing on the victim and extracting her from the situation. In terms of framing help seeking, again, external help is often seen as a measure of last resort. So a lot of the women being interviewed were the ones who sat on violence for several years before deciding to take, to seek help. And this is really important, because if their first impression of seeking assistance is a negative one, then they're probably not going to return. And so social workers were complaining that when they sought to intervene, women would often disappear, and it was very hard to do follow-up work. But a lot of it stemmed from the fact that perhaps what they were recommending to the women was not a culturally appropriate intervention. So, for example, women would say, you need to... that the social worker told her to file for divorce or separate from the husband if she was serious about applying for compassionate housing or getting help to relocate her children to different schools. So in a way, they came away with the message that help is conditional on my divorcing from my husband. And because that just culturally didn't fit their model of what they should be as a wife, because they defined their success as a woman as in terms of how good a wife they were, they felt, well, there's nothing here that can be helpful to me. So the attrition in terms of follow-up is directly attributable in part to the lack of a culturally sensitized approach, perhaps to asking the right questions and, mapping it slowly so that you can educate and help the woman along to get to a point where she may be ready to acknowledge that this is the only way to escape the violence permanently, or to find a solution that she can live with, because she's more than just a victim, right? She's the mother, the community member that she has ties to, not only in Hong Kong, but also back home. So there are several factors of concern, and this is sort of reflected in a lot of the reasons they gave for not seeking help, particularly shame and honor, and I'm not going to emphasize that. There were also variations between the kind of barriers service providers highlighted compared to what the women themselves highlighted as barriers. And I particularly want to highlight that they thought lack of legal knowledge and language were some of the major barriers that women faced. And also in Australia, cultural perceptions of DV was highlighted. They underestimated the women's sort of lack of confidence in the legal systems. Women's help-seeking patterns, none of them sought medical attention in Hong Kong, but majority of them share with friends and family. They cited familiarity and a sense that somebody understood what they were saying without thinking they were crazy or had this, really conservative culture. They feared being judged in Hong Kong and both in the UK as well. So the options pursued tend to be very, very limited, but the majority were either indecisive or took no action or ultimately would go back to the abuser. Religious leaders were not a popular option, so seldom were they going back to their religious leaders for advice. So internal and external factors. Competence of agencies, the majority of them highlighted that they did not feel sufficiently capacitated to be able to handle the needs of ethnic minority women, but in general also they learned that they were not very well-versed in terms of legal knowledge. Especially alarming were their lack of knowledge on CEDAW laws relating to equality and DV-specific laws, particularly the service providers. And I think what's even more glaring is the fact that the victim women in Hong Kong were better informed about all of these than the service providers on the front line. So you can see consistently the knowledge gaps that are there can be detrimental in terms of devising a suitable safety plan for the women if they have no knowledge of what is the appropriate or possible course of action under the law. Quality of service. Women were generally critical of the services they received. They were not necessarily satisfied and thought there were several shortcomings and things could be improved. Language barrier is in Hong Kong at least the biggest barrier. So despite the availability of a real-time TransLink online immediate sort of translation service, the usage rate of this device in the last 6 years since it's been set up is 0%. So even though facilities and resources are there, for some reason victims aren't being given access to real-time translation. They experience discrimination and are very worried about that, oftentimes being told to go back to their home country if they don't like it here, or if they can't deal with divorce, then they may as well choose to live with the abusive situation and otherwise get over their culture, extract themselves. Social workers seem to display a tendency to be the gatekeepers of the public purse, so they didn't feel the women were entitled because they were immigrants. So they're they're short stay people, they're not permanent residents. Why should we waste public resources on this group of people? There was particularly problematic language in relation to mainland Chinese women who were coming to Hong Kong. And I think the sense of them drawing on the public's resources was particularly acute. Cultural competence. Hong Kong service providers underscored themselves and said that they did not feel relatively well equipped to deal with women's cultural issues. In terms of competence training, half of them were undergoing it, but half were not, and they cited a variety of reasons. But the most surprising one to me was that some of them thought it was not useful because they could never come to accept a minority person's perspective on the acceptability of certain solutions in response to violence. So this suggests to me a lot of a need for sort of training and education in the sort of mapping exercise of what kind of experiences a woman is going through as a victim and how to better appreciate the role of culture in that context and to want to learn about their cultural and social identities so that they can do their work better. The manuals I reviewed in terms of the training materials for cultural sensitivity, some of them themselves had stereotypical messages about particular communities, and that's not the idea behind cultural sensitivity training. So there's also sort of who's delivering the training, and is that being evaluated as well? So best practices. I found the Australian models to be quite significantly advanced and progressive in that their case management involved not only risk assessment and also looking at the culturally and linguistically diverse background and needs of the women, but also to provide childcare, counseling, financial assistance, look at the housing needs of the women, give them legal advice, and escort to relevant services whenever they needed it. But also one of the interesting thing about what they were able to do was to get everyone into one room with the victim. So she only had to share sort of her ordeal once, and everybody then conducted the mapping exercise together, rather than what we have here in Hong Kong and sometimes in the UK, where you're going to each agency to explain again and again and again your experience. And that has a real draining effect on the women concerned. And primarily, they don't have the time, especially if they're away from the abuser for a long period. They'd be suspected of being up to something, and that could be a source of retaliation as well. So this sort of disciplinary networking that was happening was seen to have very strong results for women and high rates of victim retention as well in working through their issues. There are some specialist agencies I looked at in the United Kingdom and found that because they were raising community awareness on one hand, they had a relationship with religious leaders and community leaders, there was a strong sense of trust. And also the victims felt a sense of familiarity with those groups. And they preferred going to these specialist agencies, for example, for Jewish women or for Kurdish women. There were, however, some victims saying, I prefer going somewhere where nobody is likely to know anything about me because I'm worried about gossip. So they wanted the option. So they didn't mind that there were specialist refuges and things like that. They thought it might be good, it might be empowering for some people. But for some people, they felt, well, I don't want to have anything to do with anybody in my community because I know they're going to judge me. So giving women the power to choose by having a number of resources. In Hong Kong, there was a specialist agency focusing on rehabilitation for Nepalese drug offenders or drug abusers. And it was primarily sort of tailor-made by drawing on the expertise of big brothers who were former drug offenders themselves or ex-abusers. And they built on the positive sort of cultural values that they had and on the strengths of the people in terms of their affinity towards music. So this center used their interest in learning music as a way to help the users get over their addiction, but also worked with them to, develop lyrics and actually sort of a whole album with songs so that they had an outlet for their frustration, their violence, their addiction, and an ability to sort of recover by looking inward and reflecting on who they were and then who they became after getting over that addiction. And it's been a very successful model, which is not widely practiced, it's not widely known in Hong Kong, but was found to be very effective in the Nepalese community in terms of reducing the rates of recidivism in terms of offending. So it's important to debunk cultural myths and to think of it as baggage or barriers, but rather to understand and equip yourself so that you can develop better interventions rather than sort of stereotyping. So not problematizing culture, but seeing it as a tool which women can draw on for strength. So the conclusions are, as we can see, violence is culturally constructed, so are our responses. There is a legal obligation which extends to all of our roles as service providers on the front line, and we need to do a better job of understanding and mapping, the situation of the women concerned so that we can provide equal protection in fact. And this requires identifying various factors that disempower women. We do a knowledge review of our intake processes and identify different types of victims and their various needs so that we can move towards empowerment, raising awareness, and improving our attitudes and moving towards a rights-based approach to service provision. That's all I'll say for now. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions before we move on. Yes? Could you press the button in front of you, please? Sorry, I can't hear you. Would you mind to press the button?
Yeah, I am Kalyan Pokhrel and I am doing LLM Human Rights in EHKU. Yeah, I have three different aspects I want to ask, or I want certain further information from you. Whether the due diligence clause that has been infringed under the heading of so-called liberal society, the right to privacy, how the right to privacy has also undermined the domestic violence, that first one. And second one, whether the institutional mechanism which is supposed to address the domestic violence that is gender sensitive or not, whether the woman may feel quite comfortable to express her grievances before the women themselves, whether that factor has been addressed properly or not, that I want to ask if you have found from your study in
Sorry, which factor?
Yeah, the gender factor.
gender.
Whether the representation of the woman in the redressal mechanism. For example, if you are going to the police station, whether the such FIR is supposed to be considered, or the reporting, or the what the story is recorded by the woman themselves, or the woman's officer, or that may be the male, because that may be also the differentiate between how she express. That is the question. And the third one is the question of how the society thinks about for example, how many male members are in this seminar. That is also the matter of the representation. Means whether the domestic violence is the sole domain of the woman, or that is the factor that should be mitigated or not. That I want to three different questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I'll take the second question first, because there is material in the slides, but I didn't get around to it. It's very, very important to recognize that there is the gender dimension. And in fact, in the narratives, we found often when women were calling the police would come. In one instance, for example, the police came and didn't even speak to the victim, because the father-in-law who was present opened the door and he spoke fluent Cantonese. So as a Punjabi woman, she couldn't speak English or Chinese very well. And the police got the entire account of what happened from the father-in-law, didn't bother cross-checking with her, didn't take her statement, and simply asked her to pack her things and said, "We're going to take you to a shelter." And the father-in-law told her, "Don't worry, it'll be okay, and you can come back when things have cooled down." So this woman had a young baby of just a few months old, and the police asked her to leave the baby behind because she was told she wouldn't have room in the shelter for the baby. So she left, believing that everybody has her best interests at heart. And it's been sort of more than 2 years now. She's never seen her baby. She doesn't have access to the baby. So she was misinformed both. And the police didn't follow the protocol that they do have. So of course in Hong Kong we have a protocol. You must have an on-site interpreter. You must speak directly with the victim to ask, why did you call 999? And you must then take the requisite steps. But she was completely ill-advised. And language here was one barrier, but also advantage was taken of the fact that, the police then didn't have to deal with her and could just deal with whoever was easier to work with. So that's happened. Also, in terms of asking for women officers to come along, a number of women I interviewed said that they were often told that there's no female officer available on duty and that men would show up. And the men, in fact, the officers would ask questions that were quite insensitive or inappropriate. So say, where are your injuries? Show me. So it was very difficult for them to then proceed further because they thought, I have to show my injuries and I would rather show it to a female officer. So if none is available, I'll just ask him to go away and I'll deal with it later. And of course, they don't bother. So this is what I meant earlier when I said their first impressions are really important, because if that's what happens the first time, then they're not going to call the police again if they experience violence the second time. So there's definitely a lack of gendered sensitivity. And in fact, it came up at a hearing that we had in the Legislative Council recently where, a lot of organizations working with women victims said that the police display a lack of gendered sensitivity towards the type of questions they ask, the setting they provide for victims to privately convey the details of their ordeal. It's just not done well enough, and more needs to be done there. In terms of men's roles, I completely agree with you. I think it's really sad that we don't often see enough men or male academics or what have you at discussions of this sort, because gender violence is not a woman's problem. And as Professor Gilchrist said, there are male victims of violence as well. And so clearly this is a problem that needs to be thought of more broadly. And we've got various initiatives. Hong Kong U has a He for She initiative where we're trying to enlist men in the fight for equality for women, but that's just a very small step on a long, long journey. But definitely men who are in a position of authority, who can do something about this, need to be better informed about the tools here. On due diligence and privacy, there is this tension, but of course, as we know from jurisprudence, the right to privacy cannot take priority over the right to safety of the person and right to life. Right? So there's always a balance that's got to be struck. And in terms of at least enforcing the law, it's seen to be as a matter of public interest. And so privacy concerns would have to be relegated to that broader public interest. Okay? Esther? No. Okay. Well, we have time for just one last question before we move on. Anybody? No? Good. Okay. So with that, I'd like to invite Professor Edward Chen of the Department of Social Work at the University of Hong Kong to deliver his presentation. Professor Chen is an associate professor, and he's also a Fulbright scholar who received the Senior Research Award from the RGC Fulbright Hong Kong Research Scholar Program in 2013 to 14. He was also recently awarded the Hong Kong U Social Sciences Outstanding Research Output Awards in 2014. His research includes epidemiology and culture-specific risk factors for family violence, child and family polyvictimization, and he's the author of over 100 articles in various peer-reviewed journals and books, and has been very active in research in the region, predominantly mainland China, but as I understand it, he's expanding broadly into other parts of Asia. And we're very, very pleased to have him today to share his research on formal and informal social control, responding to family polyvictimization. Thank you, Edward.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning. So I hope you're not that tired and still paying attention. So thank you very much for having me here. It's my honor to share with you some of my research and observations. And basically, the message is very simple, and somehow I feel like it could be a common sense to practitioners, but unfortunately, researchers or scholars are always falling behind and then get evidence to prove something that we might have already known about this. So my message is very simple, that we do see quite a lot of families. They are not just having one problem, not just having one type of violence in the family. So always they come together with multiple types of violence. So, but this simple message, I have already taken over 10 years to get evidence and then to show how complicated it could be. So, when comparing to the existing study, if we identify, for example, there may have over 10,000 or if not 100,000 of studies focusing on different types of abuse, we do see only probably around 100 to 200 studies studying the co-occurrence of partner violence and child abuse. That's the problem of the research in the field. Just like actually, David Finkel is a scholar, professor from the United States, and then we work together on some research project. He and his team identified the problem of existing approach of studying family violence. Basically, it's a very pragmatic approach. Most of the study, they focus on a single type of study. And his team has already developed a measure on the child polyvictimization. They focus on child victimization, but look into multiple types of victimization. So from the study, basically they identify that about 1/5 of the children, they suffer from more than 4 types of violence. So that could be including the abuse in the family by their parents, peer violence or bullying in school or community violence, etc. And for those party victims, they are highly related to the trauma symptoms. So as you can imagine. So basically, I follow the lead of this direction of research, and then add somewhat different types of violence in the family. For example, in the existing research, we find out that IPV could be related to elder abuse. This is the percentage, but the range is too wide because basically among these few studies, they are using different measures, different samples. And child abuse could be related to elder abuse, or we have a bit more studies related to child abuse and IPV. So, but then the problem is that the families, they are not they're not having the choice to pick up one type of violence. Somehow, because they have different problems, they may have experience for more than several types. So I look into, say, 3 types of more. and then find out that basically we don't have any study focusing on that. So I have one publication this year focusing on family product victimization, not just on the child, but then to see if a family, they suffer from more than 2 types or even 3 types of violence, what happened to this kind of family? So these are the part of the figures. I collected data from Hong Kong and 5 provinces in mainland China. Basically, over half of them, they have suffered at least 1 type of violence. And if talking about 2 types of more, we have about 11%, and 3 types of more, we have about 2.5% of them, they suffer from more than 3 types of violence. That's including child abuse, IPV among parents, and also elder abuse. And from this analysis, we see that for, say, multiple types of violence that could be related to gambling, smoking, alcoholic, and substance dependence. So the more types they have been experiencing, the more likely that they have been associating with all this addictive behavior. And in terms of the consequence, we also find a pattern that for families or members, they have suffered for more than 2 types or 3 types of violence, they are more likely to suffer from PTSD, depression, and some other health-related issues like physical health, and especially for mental health issues. So this, I would say that this should be well recognized by practitioners. That so you see, for a person, they suffer more types of traumatic experience that could be quite suffering. But then the point is that we are not really looking into these issues from research and also from the system perspective. So I have another paper working on child victimization, and then I try to explain that, say, how come a family that could be suffering for more. So one approach is to look into the association between different types of abuse. And again, from this, we can always look into the very complicated statistics, but the message is also very simple, that if we see that if a family, they suffer from IPV or parental child abuse, in-law conflict, or elder abuse, any type of this, that could be increasing the chance of having a child being poly-victimized. So that means when we see 1 type of violence, it's very likely that they may be experiencing another type of violence in their family. So this message has already been proven from David Finkelhaus's study when they are working on the child poly-victimization in the United States. And again, this is only talking about the same message. So when you see the child poly-victimization, 4 types of more, then you see that it's very highly associated with parental IPV, parental child abuse, in-law conflict, and elder abuse. This is another figure, so using the odds ratio to show that the relationship. So unless you're very interested in the statistics, otherwise we just get a take-home message. So the conclusion is that we see that there are high preference rate of co-occurrence between different types of family and also family violence and also child victimization. And if we are focusing on the child first, if a child experiences 1 type of victimization, it's very likely that they will be exposing to another type of violence. For example, if a child being neglected in the family, you can imagine that the parents are not available to support the children, probably because of partner violence or other issues, family issues. But then you can imagine if that child has experienced bullying in school, basically, do you think that the parent will be available to help the child, to support the child, or advise the child to deal with the bullying in school? We are not saying that violence in the family is really leading or making it happen that bullying would be, say, occurred in the school setting, but it's always associated probably because of the family functioning is not that good, and sometimes they may be sharing some other, we call it risk factors like gambling issues or addictive behavior. Some could be related to poverty. So this is another area that we are looking into. And some could be related to the family member suffering from chronic illness. Then the whole family could be quite stressful. So we haven't yet have a lot of data on this, but we keep working on this to identify the family-related risk factor. But anyway, we see that when a child or the family member, they suffer from poly-victimization, then we see that we can identify the very negative health and mental health impact on the family member, on victims, and also on other surviving members. Then we look into two areas of, say, intervention. One is from the formal service. The other is from informal service. That part is probably related to some figures that Buja has just presented. So for formal service, basically, although I said that the message should be very simple and direct, but the point is that when our services are highly specialized, especially in the United States, I share these figures among the scholars and also the practitioners. Although they find the message is very helpful, but they find it very difficult to break through the boundaries because, for example, they have CPS, Child Protective Services. If they want to make a referral, if they identify one of the parent or maybe the mother of the abused child is also the victim of partner violence, then supposedly if they are well aware of these issues, they should make a referral to another service like refugees for better women or some other services. But the boundary is so difficult or so time-consuming for them to break through or even make a referral. Not to mention that it's not that easy for them to sit together and then discuss the issues. I visited Michigan for a year a few years ago, and then I can only recognize that within a small county, they can bring together some practitioners from different services and then make it a platform, like say for communication only. So it doesn't really imply that throughout the system, the whole system can work together to deal with the cases. So basically, when the services are highly developed and very specialized, that also implies that the boundary between the services are so at least not available to deal with the complexity of the family violence. So for family, if they suffer from different types of violence, that may be related to several types of services. And then it comes to our problem that whether we have, say, effort being made to break through the boundaries. This is what we have to consider. And also, supposedly, it should be very straightforward that if we see the association between different types of services, then supposedly, for a social worker, for example, in a shelter, if they are helping the abused women, but they also will be able to identify that a child could be also the victim of a child abuse. But then if we are more aware or well-trained to do the proactive screening for other types of abuse, that means you have to move a step further. That you're not just focusing on the services that you're ready to provide, but also take a step further to do at least a proactive screening for other types of abuse. That will be affecting your whole intervention plan. If you rely on the parents to prevent child abuse or to help children, but if they are also the victims of partner violence, basically you cannot take it for granted that they are available to help. They want, but they are not capable to help. Then you probably need to reconsider the whole intervention plan. And other issues like, is not just involving social workers, but also probably in legal or criminal justice practitioners, that if they deal with the issues that whether they can say take a whole look. I'm not talking about taking a whole family approach and then maintaining the family harmony is the ultimate concern. I basically challenge this idea. So especially when we put together all these issues, especially in Chinese and also in Asian families, that it's not difficult to claim that we put the child, the benefit for the best interest of the child. Okay, but when the interest of a child and also the interest of adults or the family, they are in conflict, very likely that the children's benefit will be ignored. So it's like, I would say these are the competing values, that whether we really focus on child or women victims' welfare rights, or we sometimes consider so-called the whole family, the benefit. So I want to highlight one point that so in 2008, we have the amendment on DVO, Domestic Violence Ordinance. Now they changed the name to include the same-sex couples. So that was groundbreaking in the sense that they include the next friend. Before that amendment, if we want to apply for restraining order for a child being abused, they have to be represented by their parents. And that could be ridiculous because one of the parents could be abuser, right? And the other non-abusive parents, they probably will be the victim of violence, or they're not very, willing to apply for restraining order to stop the husband abusing the child. That could be quite complicated. But then with many parties' effort that we introduced the next friend concept. So basically, for relatives or grandparents or even teachers or social workers, supposedly if you are related to that child, you can represent the child to apply for restraining order. Okay, of course, eventually it's up to the judge to determine whether they will issue the order. But that could be groundbreaking because we are no longer assuming that parents are the only party represent the child. Because when they are not functioning well or even they are abusive, then probably the whole system should recognize that some other stakeholders relevant to the child should be available to help. In the past, they want to help, but they have no room to play their role. But right now, in principle, they have the right to do so. But then in reality, how many cases that could be, say, applied that I doubt. So probably, at least I asked a shelter that they have been working on these issues. Probably, even for women victims, I guess probably for a shelter, no more than 10 cases in a year that will be, using this ordinance to help the victims, women victims or child victims. So if every year, right now in Hong Kong, we have about 4,000. That number is more when compared to Scotland, right? But it's still uprising. So that's pretty bad news that basically it doesn't really matter whether our economy is going good or bad. The reported cases have been increasing throughout the years. So right now, in last year, we have about 3,900 something, about 4,000 women victims reported to the system, and about approaching 900 child abuse cases. So even we focus on this less than 5,000 children and women victims, I wonder whether we have more than 100 cases applying for injunction order every year. So on paper, they have the right to apply for legal aid, but we keep learning that for legal aid service, they prefer to help them to proceed for divorce rather than applying for injunction order. So that could be related to the attitude of the practitioner, and also, so in Hong Kong, the issue is that it seems like we have the services available, including legal aid, but they are not accessible to different extent. So Pooja has already mentioned some issues related to ethnic minorities or immigrants, but there are some other issues that could be related to even local residents. They also find it difficult to really access to the services they are supposed that they should have the right to access. So we should focus on this and then take a look. I highlight another issue. I keep using this example, and unfortunately, I don't see the situation has been improved a lot. That was a child being killed by the parents, not directly, but being locked in the suitcase, and then after a few hours, being killed. So it was about 10 years ago. But then the judge, this is a sentence, and then it's talking about that it has no public interest. That's funny. It has no public interest. So violence in the family, if you consider this is a private issue, yes, this is of no public interest. But if we have this mentality, then we have to reconsider the whole issues, whether family violence is really a personal or private issues. Of course not. Otherwise, we are not here to deal with the issues. Another point is that they assume that the parents, they have already lost the child, and then they suffer. Okay, so but it was these two parents, they put the child being locked in the suitcase, and that's not I don't believe that it's a common way of doing this, physical punishment or corporal punishment. But many parents, they do their own stupid way of corporal punishment in different ways. And it seems that the people are very sympathetic to the parents because they have already lost a child. But how to make a balance that they have just killed the child? And they are good people with father having a positively good character. That's we are familiar with all this defense, right? And then eventually they put the mother for a longer period of imprisonment. The mother was being put in prison for 2 years, and the father 1 year and 9 months. The reason why the mother should bear more, at least 3 months more imprisonment to bear the more responsibility, because that mother was present when the child was being locked. The father was also participating, but then they left home for the whole afternoon. Then I would say that very funny, it's really gender insensitive because it's always the mother feel like you take responsibility for caring family, right? But then eventually it's the mother bearing more legal responsibility. And then what's the message? So I should be glad, right, as a father, that if I ignore my family, then I would bear the little risk of any accidents or incidents in the family, right? That's not fair to most mothers. And also, they assume that they have another surviving child, that they just hope that, so with one of the parents being released earlier, then it would be helpful to take care of another surviving child. And I can never take it for granted that these parents could be protective anymore. Yes, they learn a lesson, but who guarantee that they can prevent another tragedies from happening? I have no confidence about that. So basically, how we have to consider all this, and is it the cost concern? Of course, they will argue that it's out of the business, it's not their business, but then it leaves social workers or other personnel to do so. But do we expect the judge to be more sensitive? In Hong Kong, I don't know, I don't want to bring the system, but basically we are proud of having a very independent legal system in here. But I feel like, say, when I visit, Rochester, I can go, I was invited by the judge to talk to them in the courtroom. When I was visiting London, and then I was invited to go there and then talk to the judge in the courtroom. But in Hong Kong, basically, it's very hierarchical and it's very difficult to talk to the judge, and not to mention that they will be ready to learn from other people, like a psychologist or social worker or whatever. So basically, yes, they are very independent, but to some extent that they kind of out of touch with the reality. And should we expect something like they should be, not just the judge, but the whole criminal justice practitioner, should they be more gender sensitive or being more concerned about the child's safety? I quickly highlight another issue that is about informal social control. Just like Butcher mentioned that quite a lot of, help-seeking behavior, especially in Hong Kong, and I believe in Asian countries, they turn to their family and their friends first. So when you compare this, of course, you can advocate for more formal services, which I agree. But we also need to consider that the informal support network are always available, but they can be protective and also be risky. It depends. Because imagine that if a victim, women victim, they turn to their family member or religious group, and then they show support and very sympathetic to the experience, and then they tell the women victim, go home and forgive your abuser. And then we are always support, but we don't want your family being broken down. Is it helpful? Is it really helpful? I feel like this kind of informal social support could be quite dangerous. But what I mentioned is that this the recent study that we focus on informal social control. This is what we can do for social workers and in your public education. We advocate among the informal network to be playing a role for social control. That means they are also upholding the zero tolerance of violence. They send the message very clear to the victim and also to the abuser. If the abuser is also the member of the community, then they should make the message very clear to the abuser, and then tell the abuser that we are going to intervene. And we are not assuming that this is only a private issue. So then it would be helpful. So if we are ready to send a message. So this is an article that we have been working. So we hope that although informal social control actually is somehow different from the formal services, but they could be part of our work, part of our intervention, that we can advocate the informal social control through the informal social network. So this is the message that I want to share. Thank you very much.